Welcome back to Around Town with Linda. I'm Linda Meloche, and today I'm with Steve Daut. He is the current president of the Ann Arbor Storytellers Guild, among many other things. So we're going to get Steve's story right now. So let's start by asking you that, Steve. How'd you get started in storytelling? Tell us about that.
Well, I've done a lot of different things on stage, and when I was thinking about retiring, we went to a storytelling concert at the Ark, and everybody kept saying, "You could do that. That would be right up your alley." And so I tried it, and it's taken.
What's the first story you told? What'd you tell that night at the Ark?
I have no idea. I think, well, I told a story about when I was a kid, and trying to learn how to do cursive writing. Being a left-handed person, it just didn't work out quite the way the instructor anticipated.
Okay.
So.
And since then, where have you told stories? What are some of the moments that you'll always remember telling stories here in Michigan?
Well, I have told stories at the Ark. I have what's called a fringe coming up, and I'm going to be telling that in Northland's conference in Madison, Wisconsin. And also I'm going to tell that at the National Storytelling Network in Kansas City. So Fringe is basically it's a 55-minute show, and in my case it will be a one-man show.
Okay, all right.
So.
And what do you plan on telling there?
I'm going to tell a series of 4 stories.
Okay.
One is about my childhood and growing up in a family with 4 kids, and some of the problems that we had, some of the early childhood issues, and then the second story is about a guy who I met in New Orleans, and third is actually about a house that I bought and a crazy guy that I met that I bought that house from in Chelsea, and then the final is sort of a reconciliation with my father.
Okay.
That occurred just before he passed away.
Okay.
So.
Can you give us even just a little snippet of, if you were, imagine that you were on stage right now about to tell a story, could you give us like a little bit of it? Is that possible?
Well, I can tell you a quick story if you're interested.
Right.
There was a man who was trying to figure out how he should live his life. And so he talked to his guardian angel and said, I'd like to get a preview of what heaven and hell is like. And the angel said, well, I can do that. So he whisked him away to this large room. It was full of beautiful tables that had all sorts of great food. And the angel said, well, this is hell. And the man said, well, this didn't make any sense. This stuff is beautiful. The gravies and meats, and it's luscious. And he said, well, look closer. Well, all of the souls that were sitting at these tables had large, long utensils strapped to their hands. And the utensils, the handle of the utensils were so long that they couldn't get the food to their mouths. And so once that's kind of sunk in for the guy that, you're going to be there forever with all this wonderful food, but you can't eat it. And so then as soon as that sunk in, then the angel whisked him to the next scene, and it was exactly the same scene, but the people had figured out that they could use the utensils to feed each other. Nice. So that's a quick little story.
Have you ever won like a storytelling competition?
I have not really entered competitions that okay. You try and win. I actually tried the moth a couple of times, and they never picked my name. Yeah. So because it's a lottery, you throw your name in the hat, and they just never pulled it out. And after a couple of times, I'm so used to being ready beforehand and knowing I'm going to have a certain amount of time that just that lottery system. After a couple of times, I said, "Yeah, the universe is telling me something. I was not picked twice. I'm done. That's enough."
All right. It seems like a lot of your stories, or some of them anyway, come from your childhood. So tell me about where you grew up, what were you like as a kid, and some of those stories that rise to the surface that stand out from your childhood.
Okay. Well, I was born in Davenport, Iowa. I grew up in Muscatine, so I was kind of a river rat, and I had a little bit of a Tom Sawyer-ish childhood. I remember in Muscatine there's this big ramp. It's a parking lot, and the whole thing kind of ramps right into the river. And there was a building right beside this ramp that had an abutment that stood probably 2 or 3 feet over the water level, and we used to take our bikes and ride it out the abutment and just fly through the air and then crash into the water and drag it back and do it over and over and over again. And we had a little cottage that we would go to on the river, and we'd paddle across to this island out there in the middle of the Mississippi. And so those are some kind of fun times as a kid.
Did you have a big family, brothers, sisters?
I had 2 sisters and 1 brother.
Okay.
There was Randy, the oldest, and then Glenna, and then myself, and then Lila. And Randy was kind of had all of the privileges and responsibilities of being the oldest. I only saw the privileges because I was a young kid. Right. And
And what were you like, Steve?
Well, I became a bit of a pistol, I would have to admit. My father was taken away by the police when I was 7, and I didn't really know why, because my mom didn't talk about it. She couldn't talk about it very well, and she was a Quaker, so she was quiet all the time anyway. But
let's back up. You grew up in a Quaker home. Tell me what that's like.
Well, Quakers are really good at silence. They are. One of the things that my mom would do is, if we were bad, we would get the silent treatment. She would recruit the other 4 kids to give us the silent treatment, and it kind of followed the 90% rule. 90% of the time it was directed against me.
I get it. Okay. For those who don't know, explain the Quaker religion.
Well, it was actually began as kind of a rebellion against some of the other. I mean, it's a Christian religion, but the founder, George Fox, in the 1600s was really kind of persecuted because they considered it a bit of blasphemy. He believed in the inner light. You don't proselytize. You don't really talk about it. You hold your religion inside, and so when they do worship services, for instance, they do a silent worship. You sit in silence until you're moved by the Spirit to speak, and then you say your piece, and then you settle back into silence and you wait for the next one. So it was it's very interesting, but it was kind of horrible for a 13-year-old boy, because all 13-year-old boys have horrible secrets, and there were times when I would sit, and all these adults, well, by definition they were old people because I was 13, and they would sit in silence, and then they would all be moved by the Spirit, and I would convince myself that I was the last one. Everybody else had spoken, and now they're sitting very patiently in silence waiting for me. Oh, it was horribly, just very intimidating.
But then did you generally speak up or choose not to?
No.
Okay.
Occasionally I did.
Okay. You are not a Quaker yourself to this day?
Well, I am. How do I say that? I'm not really a practicing Quaker, but a lot of those values translated. I mean, I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, and in hindsight, that's because of the way I was brought up, And I'm real comfortable with silence. I am definitely a pacifist, and so I do tend to. I'm not really fond of pomp and circumstance. You know, some of the rituals of the more formalized churches, I tend to sort of push away from that because, frankly, Quakers are not really into that kind of ritual. So.
And your father was a Quaker also, that your whole family?
Oh no, my father was the devil.
Okay. Tell me more.
Well, I didn't know exactly what his problem was, but I knew that, for instance, the neighbors didn't want to have their kids over to our house because of my father, and my mother was so kind of bothered by all of his problems that she wouldn't tell me, and so all I knew was that I couldn't have kids over, you know, I couldn't have friends over. I knew that when I was 7, the police came and took him away, and then we left, and that was it.
And that was the last you saw of your father?
No, he would come and visit.
Okay. Okay.
But so I could tell you a story about that. He used to come over. When he came over to visit, he didn't have a whole lot of money. So every time he would be driving a different car. And I went into this practical joker phase. And so I bought one of these. It was called a car whistle. And you put it in the tailpipe of the car and just kind of wedge it in there. And when the car started, then it would have this horrible whistle. So he was inside doing some things about the, money and all that. And I stuck that thing in the tailpipe, and he got in the car and he took off. And it was just this ear-piercing whistle. I mean, there were low-flying aircraft was crashing, and dogs were barking, and neighbors were coming out and going, "What is going on?" And it was, and he just started driving away. He was so used to all these noises coming from his cars, he didn't even notice the whistle. And I had to stop him. I ran down the road after him. Stop! And so I said, "Dad, do you want me to take that whistle out of there?" And he said, "Oh, you know how to do that?" It's a true story.
Okay. All right. So when you were a kid, you said you were also involved in magic shows and presenting magic. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. Well, okay, so my brother was, he was valedictorian. He did all these wonderful things. And then my sister, she was really good in school as well. And so for me to distinguish myself, right, I became the bad boy. So I was always, looking for who's the next bad boy I can emulate. And so I got involved with Houdini. I would go to the library and I'd find every book I could find on Harry Houdini, because he was a bad boy. He was like, they'd lock him up in jail, and he would get out, and they put him in shackles, and they'd put him in a bag, and they'd put the bag in a box and lock it up and throw it to the bottom of the river, and he would get out. He was like, he laughed in the face of death. How bad can you get, right? So when I was like 12, 13, I actually learned a lot of his techniques, and I made, for instance, a straitjacket out of pillow slips, and I built this wooden box that you could padlock, and I would go inside the box, and I would get out, and I'd do these little magic shows in the backyard, and that actually kind of carried through for a number of years. When I was in college, I got involved with the happy hour group, and I started doing little tricks, and they kept me involved every week. Show me that trick, but you can't show them the same trick. So for 2 years, every week, I was learning new tricks. And for probably 20 years, I would do shows most weekends, and kid shows and some adult shows and so forth.
Did you have a name for your act? Were you called anything in particular, Steve?
Oh, I would call myself Stevini.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Do you still do magic today?
I do not.
Okay.
Well, occasionally. I mean, I do little coin tricks, but not like I used to.
Okay.
For a number of years, I could, if you gave me a deck of cards, I could do 2 hours worth of tricks. But
Okay.
as I told you, I don't really do magic anymore. But I saw this trick, and I'm trying to figure out how it works. So what happened was this guy had a couple of cards, and one's folded lengthways and one's folded widthwise. And what he did was he took one of these cards and he slipped it inside the other one, just like that. And then he took them. So they're both backside outside. They're folded differently, but they're folded the same in that they're backside outside. And then what he did was he flipped them around like this. So now they're both front side outside. And then he snapped his fingers, and then one went backside outside, the other one's front side outside. And then he did it like halfway. He snapped his fingers like halfway, and it went halfway in. Now, I can't figure out how this works. But I was thinking that maybe you could take a look and figure it out for me, because I don't know how it works. That's it.
Oh my gosh.
Well, if you figure it out, let me know, so I can. That way, maybe I can do it myself. That's gone by the wayside. I sample things. It's like I have ADD or something. I do something, I get pretty good at it, and then I move it on to the next thing.
Like spook houses?
We did spook houses, yeah. We used to, every Halloween for a couple of weeks, we would do spook houses down in our basement. And I was generally the mechanic. I would be the guy who would sit upstairs, and we had a register that went all the way through, and I would have all these strings laid out where I would, we'd make a bat and have a string that went across, and it was all painted black so you couldn't see the strings, and then we'd attach a toilet tube to the top of the bat, right, and so one string would pull it, and then I had a string on the back that I could reset it and make it go back again, and it was just crazy stuff. And I would be up on the top floor looking down through this register, and I would listen for cues. So somebody, Randy or Glenna, would be doing the tour downstairs and go, "Oh, what's that?" And that was my cue to pull the bat, and make the bat go, So,
You said about going to college. Where'd you go to school?
University of Iowa.
Okay.
Go Hawks.
And what'd you study?
I studied geology
Okay.
and geophysics.
And that led to your career. Tell us about that.
It did. Well, I spent 20 years. I started in the oil industry, and after about 5 years, that was 1986, and the whole industry collapsed. Seemingly overnight, about 450,000 people were out of work. There was a joke that went around that the biggest employer of oil of geologists was Kmart, and today it would be Walmart. But I went out as a consultant at that point, and actually had a pretty successful career for the next 7 years as a consultant, and then I spent another half dozen years in environmental science, and so about 20 years as a geologist.
Okay. And when did you stop doing that?
when I took a job at St. Louis Center.
So at this point, as a geologist, you have not yet moved to the Chelsea area. Is that correct, Steve?
I had.
Okay.
Yeah, I had moved into Chelsea. Actually, I moved to Chelsea in late 80s.
And how did you discover Chelsea?
My wife at the time was working in Chelsea as a psychiatric nurse,
Okay.
and she passed away.
Okay.
So
All right. So then, after you retired from being a geologist, then what did you do next?
why?
After the consultation and whatnot.
Right. I went to work for St. Louis Center, as it was a downshift job. I had been successful enough that I wanted to get involved in the community, and I got involved. I was in 1993. I started as on village council. Spent 6 years on village council.
What was your highlight from that experience? So what would you say was your crowning achievement from being on the village council?
Right.
And then we'll talk about your notorious, you were accused of being an evildoer and selling